The Forgotten Shore. We should have never gone to the beach that night. It was my son, Danny, who convinced me. "Dad, it's the last night before school starts. Please," he begged, his eyes wide and hopeful. How could I resist? After all, the beach had always been our place, our sanctuary. But as we drove through the thickening mist that clung to the coastal road like a shroud, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The air was too still, too cold for a summer night. When we arrived, the beach was deserted, as if forgotten by time itself. The waves lapped at the shore in a slow, deliberate rhythm, each one more hushed than the last. No seagulls cried out, no distant lights twinkled from boats far out at sea. Only darkness and the muted roar of the ocean surrounded us. Danny didn't seem to notice. He darted down the sandy path, his laughter echoing against the cliffs that loomed over us like silent sentinels. I followed, my footsteps heavy, the soft sand dragging at my feet as if trying to pull me under. We set up a small fire, the crackling flames a weak beacon in the inky blackness. Danny chased the waves, the sound of his joy mixing with the steady pulse of the tide. I watched him from the fire, trying to ignore the gnawing unease that had taken root in my chest. As I stared out at the ocean, I noticed something strange. The horizon seemed to blur, the line between sea and sky dissolving into a void that stretched on forever. I blinked, trying to clear my vision, but the darkness only grew deeper, thicker, until it felt like the world was closing in around us. "Dad!" Danny's voice broke through the suffocating night, but there was something wrong in his tone. He sounded afraid. I shot to my feet, scanning the shore for him. "Danny, where are you?" There was a pause, then his voice again, trembling. "Over here, Dad, by the water." I stumbled towards the sound, my heart pounding. The fire behind me flickered, casting long shadows that danced like twisted specters on the sand. When I reached the water's edge, I saw him standing ankle-deep in the surf, staring down at something half buried in the sand. "What is it, son?" I asked, my voice shaky. He pointed with a trembling finger. I followed his gaze and felt my blood run cold. It was a bone, white, smooth, and unmistakably human. The surf retreated, revealing more. A skull, its empty eye sockets staring up at us from beneath the sand. A ribcage, fingers curled in the wet sand like they had clawed their way out of the depths. Danny and I were frozen, our breaths shallow, as more of the skeleton was revealed by the receding waves. And then, the skull moved. Not much, just a slight shift as if something deep beneath the sand was tugging at it. But it was enough to send us both stumbling backward, fear clawing at our throats. The tide came in again, covering the bones, but they didn't stay buried. As the water pulled back, the skeleton began to rise, inch by inch, until it stood before us, swaying on unsteady legs. The air grew colder, a bitter chill that cut to the bone, and the waves crashed louder, angrier, as if they too were afraid. Danny clutched my hand, his fingers digging into my palm. "Dad, what is it?" I didn't have an answer. My mind raced, screaming at me to run, but my body was rooted to the spot, trapped by a fear that I had never known. The skeleton's head turned slowly, its hollow eyes locking onto Danny. And then, it moved towards him, one slow, deliberate step at a time. I yanked Danny back, and we turned to run, but the sand beneath our feet shifted and churned, holding us back as if the beach itself wanted us to stay. The skeleton's bony hand reached out, inches from Danny's shoulder, and I felt a scream rising in my throat. But before I could react, the world tilted, the ground gave way, and we were falling into darkness, into the cold embrace of the sea. The last thing I saw before the water swallowed us was Danny's terrified face, his mouth open in a silent scream, and the skeleton's empty eyes, watching us with an almost human hunger. Then, everything went black. I woke up on the shore, my clothes soaked and heavy with salt water, the sun already high in the sky. The beach, now bathed in daylight, looked normal, ordinary even. The cliffs loomed as they always had, the waves rolled in with a gentle sigh, and the only sign of what had happened the night before was the chilling memory seared into my mind. But Danny was gone. I searched for him, screaming his name until my throat was raw, but there was no trace of my son. No footprints, no scraps of clothing, nothing but the endless expanse of sand and sea. It was as if he had never existed at all. The police didn't believe me. When I staggered into the station, wild-eyed and frantic, they listened with pity, not understanding. They sent out a search party, but when the beach was combed, they found no sign of Danny or the skeleton that had dragged him away. The story quickly spread through town, twisted by gossip until it was nothing more than the ramblings of a man driven mad by grief. But I knew what I had seen. Determined to prove it, I went back to the beach with a camera, a shovel, anything that might help me uncover the truth. But day after day, the beach remained stubbornly normal. No bones washed up, no sinister shadows lurked in the surf. It was as if the beach itself had swallowed the horror of that night, leaving me alone with my nightmare. As the days passed, people began to avoid me. Neighbors crossed the street when they saw me coming, their eyes filled with a mixture of pity and fear. The few friends I had grew distant, their reassurances hollow and their visits less frequent. I was alone, but I refused to give up. Then, one evening, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, something happened that changed everything. I had returned home after another futile day at the beach, my nerves frayed and my heart heavy with despair. The house was quiet, too quiet. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind outside seemed magnified, echoing through the emptiness. I tried to distract myself, turning on the TV, but the static hissed at me like 1,000 whispering voices, so I switched it off, plunging the room into silence. That's when I heard it, a faint scratching at the window. I froze, my pulse quickening as I turned towards the sound. The curtains fluttered as if something outside was brushing against them. Slowly, I approached, each step heavy with dread. With trembling hands, I pulled the curtain aside. At first, I saw nothing but my own reflection staring back at me, gaunt and haunted. But then, something moved in the shadows, just beyond the glass. A face, white, hollow, and unmistakably skeletal, pressed against the window. It was Danny. Or rather, what was left of him. His skull grinned at me with that same empty hunger I had seen in the skeleton on the beach. His bony fingers scraped against the glass, leaving thin streaks like claw marks. I stumbled back, tripping over a chair and crashing to the floor. My mind reeled, unable to comprehend what I was seeing. "Danny!" I croaked, my voice barely more than a whisper. The figure outside stopped scratching. For a moment, everything was still, the air thick with an unbearable tension. Then, slowly, deliberately, Danny's skeleton lifted a hand and pointed towards the front door. A cold sweat broke out on my skin. I knew I should run, should get as far away from this house as possible, but something compelled me to stay. I got up, my legs shaking, and moved to the front door as if in a trance. My hand hovered over the doorknob, the metal cool against my palm. For a moment, I hesitated, then slowly turned it and pulled the door open. There was nothing there. I stepped outside, scanning the yard, but it was empty. The street was deserted, and the only sound was the soft rustling of leaves in the evening breeze. Had I imagined it all? Was my mind finally cracking under the weight of my grief and guilt? As I turned to go back inside, a sudden gust of wind slammed the door shut behind me. Startled, I whirled around, and saw him. Danny's skeleton stood on the porch, inches from me, his hollow eyes boring into mine. Before I could react, he lunged, his bony fingers wrapping around my wrist with a grip like ice. A shock of cold shot through my arm, freezing me in place. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The world around me seemed to darken, the edges of my vision blurring as if reality itself was unraveling. Danny's grip tightened, and I felt something pulling at me, something deep and dark that wanted to drag me down into the same abyss that had claimed my son. Suddenly, the lights in the house flickered wildly, and the TV burst to life, blaring static and garbled voices that seemed to. I should have run. I should have fought back. But in that moment, as Danny's cold, skeletal fingers tightened around my wrist, I was paralyzed, trapped in the nightmare that had become my reality. The darkness in his hollow eyes seemed to swallow the world, leaving me adrift in a sea of fear and despair. Then, with a sudden, violent tug, Danny pulled me forward, out of the house and into the night. I stumbled after him, my body moving of its own accord, my mind screaming for escape. The air was thick, oppressive, as if the world itself was suffocating under the weight of something ancient and malevolent. Danny's grip was unyielding, his bony hand like a vice around my wrist. I tried to pull away, but it was no use. His strength was unnatural, far beyond anything a child, or what remained of a child, should possess. The street was eerily quiet, devoid of life, as if the town itself had recoiled in fear, leaving me alone with the creature that had once been my son. We moved towards the beach, the path familiar yet twisted in the pale moonlight. The sand beneath my feet was cold, each step dragging me closer to the water's edge. The ocean stretched out before us, a black, featureless void that swallowed the horizon. The waves no longer lapped gently at the shore. They crashed with a fury, as if the sea itself was restless, waiting for something. Danny didn't hesitate. He walked straight into the water, pulling me along with him. The cold hit me like a shock, the frigid ocean biting through my clothes, chilling me to the bone. I tried to stop, to dig my heels into the sand, but Danny's strength was relentless. The water rose quickly, swirling around my ankles, then my knees, then my waist. "Danny, please," I gasped, my voice trembling, though I knew there was no reason in those empty eyes, no recognition in that hollow gaze. The ocean continued to pull us in, deeper and deeper, until the water was above our heads. My lungs burned, desperate for air, but I was helpless, caught in the current that dragged us both down into the depths. The last remnants of light from the moon above faded, and we were plunged into total darkness. Yet, despite the crushing pressure of the water, I could see. It was as if the darkness itself had become visible, swirling around us in shades of shadow and nightmare. Danny's skeletal form glided through the water effortlessly, his grip on me never loosening. I should have drowned. I should have succumbed to the ocean's icy embrace, but I remained alive, conscious, as Danny led me deeper into the abyss. The world above, the life I had known, seemed impossibly far away, fading into a distant memory. We walked across the ocean floor, a landscape of desolation and decay. The sand was black, littered with the remnants of ships long forgotten, their rusted hulls looming like the skeletons of beasts lost to time. Strange, unearthly shapes moved in the shadows, watching us with eyes that glowed faintly in the darkness. And then I saw them, the other skeletons. They stood in the sand, half buried, their bones bleached white by the endless years spent beneath the waves. Their empty eyes followed us as we passed, their jaws hanging open in silent screams, as if they were forever trapped in the moment of their deaths. Danny stopped suddenly, and I was forced to halt beside him. Before us, the sand shifted, revealing a vast chasm that stretched into nothingness. The ocean's current pulled towards it, a relentless force that tugged at my clothes, my hair, my soul. Danny turned to me, his bony hand releasing my wrist at last. For a moment, he simply stood there, his skull tilted as if studying me, as if he was still my son trying to understand his father's fear. But there was no warmth, no recognition in that gaze, only the cold, endless hunger of the dead. With a slow, deliberate motion, Danny raised his arm and pointed towards the chasm. I stared at him, my heart pounding, but the meaning was clear. He wanted me to follow. My mind screamed in protest, every instinct telling me to run, to fight, to do anything but step into that void. But my body betrayed me, compelled by the same unnatural force that had dragged me into the ocean's depths. I moved forward, towards the edge of the chasm, feeling the pull of the abyss growing stronger with each step. As I reached the edge, I paused, my toes gripping the rough sand as if this small act of defiance could save me. I turned to Danny, one last time, searching for any sign of my son in that skeletal form. But there was nothing. Only the ocean, the darkness, and the bones of the dead. With a final, shuddering breath, I stepped into the chasm. The world tilted, the darkness rushing up to meet me, and I fell, down into the endless void. Danny's skeletal hand reached out, and I took it, the cold of his touch seeping into my very soul as we descended together, into the depths, into the blackness, where the living had no place. And then, with a silence more profound than death itself, the darkness swallowed us whole.